One thing that's really important to be aware of as a web developer is whether you're fetching your data sequentially or in parallel. And in this video, I'm going to cover the difference between both, when you might use one or the other, because you will have use cases to where you need to do both things, fetch things in parallel and sequentially. And then I'm also going to show you an example in Next.js where you can actually see the effect of fetching data in these two different ways. So let's cover sequential first. When fetching data sequentially, you're going to make one request, and then once that request is complete, you're going to kick off another request. And then once that's complete, maybe you make another request. So it's exactly like it sounds like. You are fetching data sequentially. Now, here I'm calling this fetch with delay function. It's basically just making a fetch request at my passed in URL, but it's adding an artificial delay just so you can see the differences between sequential and parallel data fetching a little bit easier. So we await fetch with delay with this URL and this amount of milliseconds. And then on the very next line, we call await again with another URL and amount of milliseconds. So because we are awaiting this first fetch with delay here, we're not going to kick off this fetch request to get our posts until this first request is complete. So we are making these fetch requests sequentially. We first await our request to get a user, and then only when that await is complete and that request is resolved, we're then going to move on to making our requests for our posts. So we make this and then we make this. These two requests combined isn't going to just take 2000 milliseconds. It's going to take 4000 milliseconds because we are going to wait until this request completes and then kick off this request. So it's going to be about 2 seconds for each, leading to about 4 seconds. So to render out this entire page, it's probably going to take a little over 4 seconds. So let's go to my sequential page here. And in loading this page, what you're going to see is the total time to load this document is a little over 4 seconds. So let me show you this again. I'm going to just click refresh here. It's pending. You can see that it's loading above here. And then a little after 4 seconds, we load this page. And that's largely because we are fetching these sequentially and each request takes 2 seconds. Now, let's look at the parallel example. In this example, we use the same fetch with delay function. We use 2 seconds for each of the delays, but right here, you'll see that we're not awaiting the user. We are just capturing that user promise, setting it to this constant user promise. And then for our post promise, we do the same thing. We don't await this fetch with delay. We just kind of assign the promise to this post promise constant. And then we use promise.all here in JavaScript to effectively await both promises here, the user and the posts. But importantly, we get to this line of code, line number 9, we return the promise right away. We immediately move to the next line of code, get this promise, and then move to line 12, where we wait for both promises at the same time or in parallel with each other. Now, one thing to just quick note for all the super nerds out there that are saying, hey, this is actually happening concurrently instead of in parallel. I get that. I'm just using the same sort of verbiage that the Next.js docs are using here in a lot of their examples, calling this in parallel. So I'm just staying consistent with that. But I totally understand. You'll probably see this both ways, to where some people refer this to as in parallel. Some refer to this happening concurrently. Both of these expressions are kind of used to describe doing multiple things that overlap in time. So try not to get too caught up in that. The most important thing to remember here is that we're having both of these requests kick off at the same time so they can complete without having to wait for one to complete and then doing the other. You can have both of these requests kind of complete during the same time or in that kind of time overlap. So just wanted to throw that in there in case some people are viewing this and thinking, wait, isn't this concurrently? Yes, there's definitely some kind of nuance in there, but the important thing is that both of these requests are kicked off and are going to occur during overlapping periods of time here. And then once these requests complete, we're going to render out the page. So for this page here, since we kick off both requests at the same time, well, it's roughly going to take about 2 seconds to render this entire page because we're not doing this sequentially. So let's go look at our parallel page. And when I go here, we should see that it takes about 2 seconds or a little over 2 seconds, which is what you see. And I'll refresh here and you'll see again, takes over just a little over 2 seconds to render this page. So as you can see, it can make a big difference when you use a strategy like promise.all to kick off both requests at the same time versus doing things sequentially. Now, in this example here for this sequential page, it would actually be totally fine to do these sequentially and to kind of eat that performance cost of doing so, because our second request here, it relies on the user ID. So we kind of have to fetch the user so we can get the user ID before making this post request here. So if you have multiple requests that are dependent on each other, there's really not a lot of ways that you can get out of some sort of sequential data fetching. Now, of course, we could, maybe fetch the user when the app loads, or maybe we could preload the user when we load this page, and then we already have that data and we don't need to do this waterfall effect. Totally understand that. But in some aspects, it's okay to sometimes do some sort of sequential data fetching if you have one request that depends on the other. However, if that is not the case, then you should really try to kick off those requests at the same time and then use something like promise.all to then wait for those requests to complete, because as you could see in our example, it can really cut down on the time that it takes for your actual page to load, for that data to load, and it can really improve your user experience. So if you don't have requests that rely on each other, kick off both of those requests at the same time. Make sure you're very aware of what you're doing with your requests, because that can be some of the most time-intensive stuff in your applications. Make sure you're aware, and if they don't depend on each other, kick them off at the same time. Use something like promise.all to wait for them at the same time. But sometimes you might have requests that depend on each other, and in those cases, it might make sense to do something like sequential data fetching like you see here. So I hope you learned something here. Thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.